Welcome to one of the most unsettling cases ever recorded in the history of Charleston, South Carolina. Before we begin, share in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time you're hearing this story. We're always curious to know how far these forgotten histories travel and at what hour they find you. Our story begins in the autumn of 1845 when the air around Charleston hung thick with the scent of river mud and the Spanish moss drooped low over the ancient live oaks. It was during that season, heavy and slow, that a series of events began to unfold, events so disturbing that they would remain hidden in county archives for more than a century. 17 miles northwest of the city, along what was then called Cypress Creek Road, stood the Hafford estate, a property that would soon become the center of whispered legends and quiet horror. Sarah Elizabeth Hafford had become a widow at the age of 32. Her husband of 14 years, Colonel James Hafford, had died that January, the official cause listed as consumption of the lungs. But even then, neighbors spoke in low tones about the odd circumstances surrounding his death. The Hafford plantation was one of the most prosperous in the region. 400 acres of fertile land and 67 enslaved laborers tending to cotton and indigo. Yet what truly set the estate apart, according to tax records from 1843, was its unusual productivity. The Haffords earned consistently higher profits than neighboring plantations of similar size, despite employing fewer overseers. That mystery, it seems, may have had a darker explanation. Documents later uncovered in the Charleston County Historical Society reveal that Colonel Hafford had established what he described as a system of incentives among the enslaved people under his control, a chilling blend of manipulation and cruelty. His private ledgers promised better food, clothing, and shelter for increased output, but the same records also detailed punishments for those who disappointed the colonel's expectations. Those entries, however, were found mutilated, water-damaged, several sections deliberately removed with what appeared to be a razor-sharp blade. Then, in February of 1845, only a month after the colonel's burial, strange rumors began to spread. Neighbors reported seeing the widow Hafford walking toward the slave quarters late at night carrying a lantern. Margaret Pinckney, who lived on the adjacent property, recorded the following in her diary on February 12th. Mrs. H. has laid aside her mourning already, appearing at church this morning in a gown of deep blue. She spoke to no one and departed before Reverend Stillwell concluded his sermon. Her conduct grows most peculiar. By early spring, those peculiarities deepened. A letter dated April 4th, written by Reverend Thomas Stillwell of St. Philip's Parish to his brother, a judge in Savannah, reads, "The widow Hafford has dismissed Mr. Daniels, the overseer who served the family nearly a decade. When questioned, she insisted his services were no longer needed, that she now manages her affairs directly. The enslaved now report to her personally, which has stirred much gossip among the neighboring estates." By May of 1845, Sarah Hafford had all but vanished from Charleston society. Her last recorded public appearance was at a spring luncheon hosted by Caroline Middleton. Several attendees later wrote of her strange, almost feverish conversation about a man she called Isaiah, described as possessing extraordinary dignity and moral strength. What few realized at the time was that Isaiah was not a visiting preacher or distant cousin, as some assumed, but one of the men once enslaved on her own plantation, and that revelation was only the beginning. When Mrs. Middleton inquired if this was a relation, or perhaps a business associate from up north, Mrs. Haverford merely smiled and said, "He is closer than you might imagine." It wasn't until June that the true nature of Sarah Hafford's interest became apparent. A letter from the Reverend Stillwell to his brother, dated June 23rd, states, "I write to you in the strictest confidence, as what I am about to relate is so shocking that I can scarcely bring myself to set it down. The widow Hafford has been discovered in an improper relationship with one of her slaves. The man in question is called Isaiah, and he is said to be the brother of her late husband's personal servant. When confronted by Mr. Pinckney and myself, she showed not the slightest remorse or shame, but rather insisted that they had exchanged vows before God. Tax records from July 1845 show that Sarah Hafford sold 23 of her slaves to a buyer from New Orleans, retaining 44, including Isaiah and his brother Thomas. An unusual notation in the margin of this document reads, "Buyer reports widow's insistence that certain individuals not be separated." This practice of keeping family units together was uncommonly humane for the period and raised suspicions among neighboring plantation owners. By August, rumors had spread throughout Charleston society. A letter from Caroline Middleton to her sister in Richmond describes how the Hafford situation has become the whispered scandal of every parlor in the county. They say she has given him a room in the main house and that they dined together. The Pinckneys swear they observed them walking the grounds arm in arm at dusk as if they were husband and wife taking the evening air. The Charleston Mercury from August 12th, 1845 contains a small item on the third page. Unusual disturbance at Hafford Estate. Sheriff Thompson called to investigate reports of gunfire. No casualties reported. This innocuous entry belies the gravity of what actually occurred as detailed in Sheriff Thompson's official report filed August 13th, but subsequently removed from county records until it was rediscovered during a courthouse renovation in 1962. According to the sheriff's report, a group of 12 men from neighboring plantations arrived at the Hafford Estate shortly after midnight on August 11th. They came with the stated intention of restoring proper order to the plantation. They demanded that Isaiah be handed over to them. When Sarah Hafford refused, gunshots were fired into the air as a warning. What happened next is described by Sheriff Thompson as a confrontation, unlike any I have witnessed in my 17 years of service. The report states that Sarah Hafford appeared on the front porch of the main house, armed with her late husband's dueling pistols. Behind her stood Isaiah and 5 other enslaved men, all bearing farm implements as makeshift weapons. She informed the intruders that they were trespassing on her property and that she would defend her home and those inside it by any means necessary. The standoff lasted nearly an hour before the group retreated, but not before their leader, identified only as Mr. P., presumably Richard Pinckney, shouted that this abomination will not stand and that they would return with proper authority. In a development that shocked Charleston society, Sarah Hafford appeared before Judge William Simmons on August 15th with a series of documents that her late husband had apparently prepared before his death. These included manumission papers for Isaiah and his brother Thomas dated December 1844, but never filed with the county. She also presented a will addendum supposedly signed by Colonel Hafford stating that these 2 men were to be freed upon his death and given a small parcel of the plantation land. Judge Simmons, a longtime friend of Colonel Hafford, found himself in a difficult position. The documents appeared authentic, bearing what seemed to be the Colonel's signature. Yet their timing and the circumstances surrounding their discovery raised serious questions. After 3 days of deliberation, he reluctantly validated the manumission papers, but ordered an investigation into the will addendum. What came to light during this investigation forms the darkest chapter of the story. Thomas, the Colonel's personal servant, provided testimony that was recorded by the court clerk but sealed by Judge Simmons. This testimony remained sealed until 1959 when it was discovered during an archival review by historian Dr. Eleanor Whitmore of the University of South Carolina. According to Thomas's testimony, Colonel Hafford had not died of consumption as officially recorded. Rather, he had been slowly poisoned over the course of several months. Thomas stated that he had observed Sarah Hafford adding an unknown substance to her husband's evening tea. When he confronted her, she allegedly threatened to sell him to a plantation in Mississippi known for its brutal conditions, separating him from his brother Isaiah and the rest of his family at Hafford. Thomas further testified that as the Colonel's health deteriorated, Sarah began to show increasing attention to Isaiah, who worked primarily in the plantation stables. She would engage him in lengthy conversations when she thought no one was observing them. According to Thomas, his brother initially resisted her advances, fearful of the consequences, but eventually succumbed to what Thomas described as a peculiar spell she cast over him. Most disturbing was Thomas's claim that after the Colonel's death, Sarah showed him a small vial containing what remained of the poison and told him that the same fate awaited him should he ever speak of what he had witnessed. He remained silent until the judge's investigation, coming forward only when it seemed that Isaiah might face serious harm from the neighboring plantation owners. Judge Simmons took the extraordinary step of sealing this testimony, noting in his private journal, later donated to the Charleston Historical Society by his granddaughter in 1948, that such accusations against a woman of Mrs. Haverford's standing, no matter how compelling the witness, would tear at the very fabric of our society. The implications extend beyond one household to questions that many would find too disturbing to contemplate. By September of 1845, Charleston society was divided. Some believed Sarah Hafford was mentally unbalanced, perhaps due to grief or some underlying condition. Others suspected a more sinister explanation, that she had always harbored improper sentiments and had seized upon her husband's death as an opportunity to act upon them. A small but vocal group insisted that she must be under some form of coercion or undue influence. On September 23rd, Sarah Hafford took an unprecedented step. She appeared before a notary public in Charleston and executed a deed transferring ownership of 10 acres of the Hafford Plantation to Isaiah Freeman, a free man of color. This transaction, while technically legal due to Isaiah's newly recognized free status, violated numerous social conventions and caused immediate outrage. The Charleston Mercury of September 25th carried a front-page editorial condemning the transaction and calling for legislative action to prevent similar occurrences in the future. The editorial stopped short of directly accusing Sarah and Isaiah of an improper relationship, but implied it strongly, referring to unnatural arrangements that threatened the moral foundation of our community. What happened on the night of October 7th remains subject to conflicting accounts. According to the official report filed by Sheriff Thompson, a fire broke out in the main house of the Hafford Plantation at approximately 1100 at night. By the time the sheriff and his deputies arrived responding to an alarm raised by a passing traveler, the house was fully engulfed. No bodies were recovered from the ruins. A different version of events emerges from a letter written by Margaret Pinckney to her cousin in Philadelphia dated October 9th. The judgment of God has finally visited the Hafford woman and her Negro lover. A group of concerned citizens, including my Richard, took it upon themselves to restore decency to our community. They intended only to remove the man Isaiah and perhaps escort Mrs. Hafford to her relatives in Virginia, but the situation became heated. I do not know the particulars, only that fire purifies all, and our men returned safely home. The investigation into the fire was cursory at best. Sheriff Thompson's report notes that the cause appears to be accidental, perhaps a candle left unattended. No charges were ever filed. The Hafford Plantation was divided and sold at auction in January 1846, with the proceeds in the absence of any heirs going to the state. For nearly a century, the story of Sarah Hafford and Isaiah would have remained buried in scattered documents and sealed testimonies, if not for discovery made in 1948 during the renovation of an old church in northern Florida. Workers removing floorboards in what had once been the pastor's residence found a hidden compartment containing a journal, 2 gold wedding bands, and a jerope of a white woman and a black man, formerly posed as if for a wedding portrait. The journal belonged to someone identifying himself only as if. The entries begin in November 1845 and continue sporadically until March 1861. They tell the story of a couple who fled South Carolina after a night of fire and terror, making their way through Georgia and eventually to a small settlement in Florida where they lived under assumed names. According to the journal, the woman known locally as Mrs. Freeman taught at a small school for the children of free black families, while her husband worked as a carpenter. They lived in constant fear of discovery, rarely venturing beyond their immediate community. The final entry, dated March 10, 1861, reads, "News of war between the states reaches us even here. Fears what this might mean for our fragile peace. I tell her that God has preserved us this far and will not abandon us now. But in the night I hear her weeping and know that the past is never truly behind us." Historians remain divided on whether it was indeed Isaiah Freeman and if the woman in the daguerreotype was Sarah Hafford. The image is somewhat degraded, making positive identification difficult. Professor Whitfield, who studied the materials extensively before her death in 1967, believed strongly in their authenticity, pointing to certain details in the journal that corresponded with known facts about the Hafford Plantation. Perhaps the most compelling evidence comes from church records in the Florida settlement. They list Isaiah and Sarah Freeman as contributors to a building fund in 1852. A notation beside their names reads, "Married by the grace of God, if not by the laws of men." In 1955, during the height of the civil rights movement, a journalist from the Pittsburgh Courier attempted to track down descendants of Isaiah and Sarah Freeman, but found no conclusive evidence that they had children. However, he did locate an elderly woman in Tallahassee who claimed that her grandmother had often spoken of the white lady teacher and her husband, who weren't supposed to be together, but loved each other until death. The land that once comprised the Hafford Plantation is now largely occupied by a suburban development and a shopping center. A small historical marker erected in 1989 makes no mention of Sarah Hafford or Isaiah Freeman, noting only that this area was once home to a prosperous antebellum plantation. The story of what happened there in 1845, a tale of murder, forbidden love, arson, and escape echoes only in scattered documents and the whispered stories that some local families still pass down through generations. In a final haunting postscript, the Charleston County Historical Society received an anonymous donation in 1968, a small glass vial containing traces of an unknown substance wrapped in a yellowed piece of paper bearing the inscription Colonel J.H., January 1845. Chemical analysis performed in 1970 determined that the vial contained residue of white arsenic, a slow-acting poison commonly used in the 19th century to kill rats and occasionally unwanted spouses. The truth of what happened between Sarah Hafford and Isaiah Freeman, whether theirs was a story of genuine affection that defied the brutal conventions of their time or something darker and more complex, remains buried with them. But on quiet nights in the modern suburbs built atop the old plantation grounds, some residents report hearing what sounds like distant footsteps moving hurriedly through their yards, as if someone is still fleeing from a fire that burned out more than a century ago. In 1972, Marcus Calloway of the University of South Carolina conducted the first comprehensive academic study of what he termed the Hafford incident. His research uncovered several documents that had previously escaped notice, including correspondence between Judge Simmons and the governor of South Carolina in October 1845. There are whispers of similar arrangements on at least 2 other plantations in the region, which I need not tell you poses an existential threat to our way of life. The governor's response, preserved in the state archives but not cataloged until Calloway's investigation, instructed Simmons to ensure that all documentation regarding this unfortunate affair is secured away from public scrutiny and to discourage further newspaper coverage by whatever means you deem appropriate. This official suppression explains, at least in part, why the story remained obscured for so long. In one letter dated October 12th, Simmons expresses concern that the Hafford matter has sparked dangerous discussions among certain segments of our population. Another significant discovery came in 1975 when renovations to the old Pinckney house revealed a hidden compartment in the master bedroom. Inside was a leather-bound journal belonging to Richard Pinckney with entries spanning from 1844 to 1847. The journal contains numerous references to Sarah Hafford, beginning with expressions of condolence upon her husband's death, but quickly turning to condemnation as rumors of her relationship with Isaiah began to circulate. The entry from October 7, 1845, the night of the fire, was partially torn out with only fragments remaining legible. Gathered at Middleton's at 8:15, men prepared to woman refused to see reason. Negro reached for weapon. Flames spread quickly. May God forgive what necessity required of us this night. Subsequent entries show Pinckney struggling with the events of that night, writing on December 3rd. I wake before dawn each morning, the smell of smoke in my nostrils. M says I cry out in my sleep. She does not know that it is not fear, but her face I see. Standing on those steps, unflinching as we approached, as if we were the ones transgressing against natural law, not her. By 1847, Pinckney had sold his plantation and moved his family to Richmond, citing health concerns, but writing privately, I can no longer look upon those fields without seeing the distant roof of H, and remembering what was done there, both her sins and our response. In 1978, the Florida Historical Society acquired a collection of papers from a church that had served the free black community near Tallahassee in the mid-19th century. Among these documents was a letter dated April 1854 from the pastor to a colleague in Philadelphia mentioning our unusual parishioners, the Freemans, and noting that Mrs. F. has established herself as a teacher of some repute, though she seldom speaks of her life before coming to us. Her husband is more forthcoming, having shared with me certain details of their flight from Carolina that would strain credibility were he not so plainly sincere. They live in constant fear, though 9 years have passed since they left that place of bondage, she as much as he, for different reasons. The letter goes on to describe how Sarah Freeman, presumed to be Sarah Hafford, had established a small school that accepted both white and black children, a radical arrangement for the time and place. The pastor writes, she teaches them together, saying that in the sight of God and in the realm of knowledge there is no distinction. Were this known beyond our small settlement, I fear for her safety. But here, protected by the isolation of our community and the respect her husband has earned through his quiet dignity, they have created something that feels like the world as it should be, not as it is. In 1982, archaeologists from the University of Georgia conducted a limited excavation at the site of the former Hafford Plantation before construction of a new housing development. Among their findings was a small underground chamber adjacent to what would have been the slave quarters. The chamber, approximately 60 square and 5 high, contained several artifacts, a collection of 12 books, including works by Shakespeare, Milton, and contemporary abolitionist writings, a slate and chalk presumably used for writing lessons, and most surprisingly, a man's ring and a woman's ring, both simple gold bands buried together in a small wooden box. Dr. Eliza Montgomery, who led the excavation, theorized in her subsequent paper that the chamber had been used as a clandestine meeting place and possibly a schoolroom. Analysis of the soil and construction suggested that it had been in use for several years before 1845. Montgomery wrote, "The evidence points to an established relationship between Sarah Hafford and Isaiah that predated Colonel Hafford's death, one that included not merely romantic entanglement, but intellectual exchange. The presence of abolitionist literature alongside classical texts suggests that their connection was founded, at least in part, on shared ideals regarding human liberty and dignity, dangerous concepts in that time and place. The rings, when tested, were found to date from the same period and showed similar patterns of wear, suggesting they had been worn regularly. No engraving or markings were found on either band." Montgomery's conclusion, controversial at the time of publication, was that Sarah Hafford and Isaiah may have considered themselves wed long before they publicly acknowledged their relationship, conducting some form of private ceremony symbolized by these rings, which were subsequently hidden to protect both parties. In 1986, a collection of letters was donated to the Charleston Historical Society by the great-great-granddaughter of Caroline Middleton. Among these was correspondence between Caroline and Sarah Hafford, spanning from 1843 to 1845. The earlier letters reveal a close friendship between the women, with Sarah confiding increasingly in Caroline about her unhappy marriage to the colonel, who is described as cold in his affections and cruel in his business. A letter dated September 1844 contains a passage that historians now view as significant. "You ask why I visit the quarters so often of late? I cannot commit to paper the full truth, dear C, but I will say that I have found in the most unexpected place a mind that understands mine as no other has. Were the world arranged differently, I would. But such thoughts are dangerous, even in private correspondence. Suffice it to say that I now know what it is to be truly seen, and having experienced this, I cannot return to the shadows of my former existence." By February 1845, after the colonel's death, the tone of Sarah's letters changes dramatically. She writes to Caroline, "You have been my dearest friend these many years, which is why I trust you above all others with what I am about to relate. I've taken steps to secure my future happiness with one who has been denied his rightful place in this world. The law and customs stand against us, but we answer to a higher authority. I know this will shock you, but I ask only that you withhold judgment until you have heard the full account from my own lips." Caroline's reply has not survived, but Sarah's subsequent letter, dated March 3rd, suggests a break in their friendship. "Your reaction, while not unanticipated, wounds me deeply. That you would threaten to involve our presumably Richard Pinckney in what is entirely a private matter shows how thoroughly you have absorbed the prejudices of our society. I had thought your Christian charity extended beyond the narrow confines of what is deemed acceptable by those whose interests depend upon the subjugation of others. I see now that I was mistaken and must proceed without the comfort of your understanding." This was the last communication between the women. Caroline Middleton's diary from October 1845 contains a brief entry regarding the Hafford fire. "News comes this morning of fire at H Plantation. Returned at dawn, clothed smelling of smoke, face grim. He will not speak of what transpired, but I know in my heart that a terrible justice has been served. May God have mercy on her soul and on ours." The most recent development in the Hafford saga came in 1994 when historian Dr. James Washington of Howard University published Voices from the Margins, a compilation of oral histories collected from descendants of enslaved people in the Charleston area. One account provided by 87-year-old Elijah Johnson contained a family story passed down through 5 generations. My great-great-grandmother was called Bessie, and she was a house servant at the Hafford place. She used to tell that Mrs. Sarah and Isaiah had been sweet on each other for years before the master died. Said they would pass notes through Isaiah's brother Thomas, who worked in the house. Said Mrs. Sarah taught Isaiah to read and write in secret, and that's how they'd communicate when they couldn't meet. According to Johnson's family tradition, the night of the fire was planned in advance. Bessie said they knew those men were coming. Said Mrs. Sarah had friends among the house servants who warned her. She and Isaiah made it look like they were in the house when the fire started, but they'd already gone out the back way, taking only what they could carry. Thomas went with them. They had a wagon waiting in the woods and made for the coast where a ship was supposed to take them north, but Bessie never heard what became of them after that. This account aligns with certain archaeological findings and documentary evidence, suggesting that the fire may have been part of an escape plan rather than a tragedy. The lack of bodies recovered from the ruins noted in Sheriff Thompson's report, but not investigated at the time, supports this theory. In 2001, marine archaeologists mapping shipwrecks off the coast of Georgia discovered the remains of the merchant vessel Northern Light, which sank during a storm in November 1845. The ship's manifest recovered from state archives listed among its passengers Mr. and Mrs. Freeman and companion traveling from Charleston to Philadelphia. The ship never reached its destination, and no survivors were reported. For many years, historians assumed that this represented the tragic end of Sarah and Isaiah's escape. However, in 2007, research into passenger lists of ships arriving in New Orleans during the same period revealed an entry for Sarah and Isaiah Freeman and Thomas Jenkins, arriving from Havana on December 18, 1845. This suggests that the couple may have deliberately arranged for their names to appear on the ill-fated Northern Light as a means of throwing off potential pursuers. The journal discovered in Florida in 1948 contained no entries between October 1845 and March 1846, leaving a gap in the narrative during this crucial period. The first entry from Florida reads simply, "We have found a place where we might live quietly." The journey here tested us in ways I could never have imagined, and there were moments when I believed we would not survive. Butts never wavered in her resolve, even when we were forced to separate for our safety. Now, reunited, we begin again, always looking over our shoulders, but determined to build something meaningful from the ashes of our former lives. What emerges from these scattered pieces of evidence is a story more complex and perhaps more inspiring than initially apparent. Sarah Hafford and Isaiah Freeman appear to have maintained a clandestine relationship for years before making it public, suggesting a depth of commitment that transcended the brutal social constraints of their time. Their escape, meticulously planned and executed, speaks to both desperation and remarkable resourcefulness. And their apparent establishment of a new life in Florida, where they contributed to their community while maintaining their privacy, reveals a determination to create meaning from chaos. Yet questions remain. Was Colonel Hafford indeed poisoned, as Thomas testified? If so, was this an act of cold calculation on Sarah's part, or did she perceive it as her only escape from an intolerable situation? The historical record offers tantalizing hints, but no definitive answers. The vial of arsenic discovered in 1968 suggests that Thomas's testimony contained at least some truth, but the full circumstances surrounding the colonel's death remain shrouded in mystery. Similarly ambiguous is the role of the Pinckney family and other neighboring plantation owners in the events of October 7th. Richard Pinckney's journal suggests deep moral conflict following the fire, but stopped short of explicitly confirming that murder was committed that night. The fact that no investigation was pursued, despite Sheriff Thompson's initial involvement, points to collusion at an official level to suppress the truth. Perhaps most poignantly ambiguous is the nature of Sarah and Isaiah's relationship itself. Was this a genuine love story that defied the barbaric racial hierarchies of antebellum South Carolina? Or was there manipulation on Sarah's part, using Isaiah as a means of escaping an unhappy marriage and the constraints of her position as a plantation mistress? The archaeological evidence of a long-standing intellectual and emotional connection suggests the former, but without direct testimony from either party, Historians can only speculate. What is clear is that the story of Sarah Hafford and Isaiah Freeman sent ripples of fear through white plantation society. The idea that a woman of Sarah's social standing would choose to reject the privileges of her position for a relationship with an enslaved man represented a profound threat to the ideological foundations of slavery. If such a choice could be made freely and with full agency, how could the myth of natural racial hierarchy be maintained? This explains the extensive efforts to suppress the story, from Judge Simmons's sealing of testimony to the governor's direct intervention. It explains why neighboring plantation owners felt justified in taking violent action to end the relationship. And it explains why for over a century the story remained fragmented across scattered documents and oral traditions, never assembled into a coherent narrative that might challenge established historical accounts of the period. In 2015, a small memorial plaque was installed at the Charleston County Historical Society acknowledging Sarah Haverford and Isaiah Freeman. The plaque reads simply, "Their story reminds us that human connections could transcend even the most rigid boundaries of their time, often at terrible cost." Visitors to the suburban development now standing on the former Hafford plantation lands occasionally report unusual phenomena: cold spots in otherwise warm rooms, the sound of footsteps when no one is present, and most frequently, the smell of smoke that appears and disappears without explanation. In 2019, a family renovating one of the older homes in the development discovered hidden within a wall cavity a small cloth bundle containing a woman's lace handkerchief embroidered with the initials SH and a hand-carved wooden figure of a bird in flight. Some local residents maintain that on certain autumn nights, particularly when the Spanish moss hangs heavy from the few remaining live oaks, the silhouettes of a man and woman can be seen walking arm in arm across what was once the plantation grounds. They appear briefly in the glow of street lights before vanishing into the shadows, leaving behind only the faint scent of smoke and ashes, a lingering reminder that some stories refuse to remain buried, no matter how thoroughly we try to erase them from our collective memory. In 2023, descendants of the Pinckney family issued a formal statement acknowledging their ancestors' role in the events of October 1845, expressing regret for actions taken in the name of preserving a social order that was fundamentally unjust. The statement concluded, "We cannot change the past, but we can commit to honoring the full truth of our history, including its darkest chapters. The story of Sarah Hafford and Isaiah Freeman deserves to be remembered, not as a scandal whispered about in shame, but as a powerful testament to the human spirit. It is a story of courage, defiance, and the unyielding need for connection in a world built to divide." For too long, their names were buried under the dust of forgotten records and the silence of polite society. Yet their truth endures, not in monuments or history books, but in the quiet courage of those who dare to love beyond boundaries. Perhaps the final word on the Hafford affair should belong to Isaiah Freeman himself. His last journal entry, written in March of 1861, still speaks across the years. "They burned our house, believing they could destroy what we built together. But they never understood. What we created was never confined within walls. It lives in every moment we have shared since, in every child we've taught to read, in every act of kindness we've offered to those around us. They tried to make us an example of failure, to prove such a union could not endure. Yet we have shown, to ourselves and to the few who truly know, that what they called impossible has carried us through fire and flight, through storm and separation. If there is justice in this world or the next, our truth will outlast the lies they told to justify what was done that night. And maybe it has. The echoes of their defiance still linger, a quiet reminder that love, when born of conviction and courage, can survive even the flames of hatred and time itself. If you were moved by this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, leave a comment, and stay tuned for our next video, where we continue to uncover the forgotten tales that shaped our shared past. Until then, remember, history's true stories are not always written in ink, but in the hearts of those who dared to live them.